Hey everyone. So for your final chapter, your final lecture, it will be on chapter 17, which covers training and professional issues in counseling psychology. So the first thing to know is that the book assumes that you want to be a counseling psychologist. So remember that counseling psychologists all have doctoral level degrees. However, not everyone who is interested in therapy wants to be in school for another 6 or 7 years to get your doctorate degree after your 4 years or 5 years of undergrad. So I'm broadening it out a bit to also cover master's degrees. Again, your book primarily just focuses on doctoral degrees, but I want to broaden it out, help you decide if you're interested in counseling, some routes that you could take because there are many routes to being a therapist to doing counseling. So again, there's master's and doctoral degrees in the US. And things to look out for. So when deciding between master's and doctorate degrees, there are a variety of different options. You can get a master's in clinical counseling or school counseling. These are typically 2 or more years after your bachelor's degree, and they prepare you to practice. They less likely would prepare you to teach or do research. I mean, you might have to do a little bit, but not very much. So these degrees um, help you practice. You can get a license with many of these degrees. And so that could be an option for some people. Masters in social work, an MSW. These are also 2 or more years. And with a master's in social work, you can also do therapy, particularly if you study clinical social work. So, clinical social workers do counseling, they do therapy. So, you can get a master's in social work. And then, like I mentioned, you can get a doctorate in a type of psychology that lets you be licensed. So, this includes clinical, counseling, or school. Now, you might ask, what's the difference between a PhD and a PsyD? A PhD has more research involved. You are writing a dissertation, that's your own research. A PsyD, you'd have to do some research, but it's not as research heavy. It's more focused on practice, on therapy. But these in general take a minimum of 5 years, and some even last longer, 8 years. So you have to be really committed to go down the doctorate route. This is after the 4 years of bachelor's. Like I mentioned, I did 4 years of bachelor's, 2 years of master's, and then I did another 5 for my PhD. So these routes are pretty long. So you should think about what do you want to do after you're done and ask the program when you're looking at programs, how do their graduates do? What do they do? Um, if you're looking at particular programs, look at what courses do they have. You should look at what internships they have that you can get practice throughout the way, because for all of these, you would need to have practicums or internships to learn about counseling or whatever it is that you're learning about at that particular internship. So these are things to think about as you're potentially looking for master's or doctorate degrees. And again, this chapter is really thinking about, okay, if you want to pursue these, if you like counseling, you're still thinking about counseling, what are some options? The next thing you should look for is accreditation. And what this means is that if something's accredited, it means that this program has met quality standards by some outside accrediting agency. It's like a stamp of approval. This agency says, okay, this is a good program, it meets certain standards, and we're giving it our stamp of approval. It's accredited. And there are different accrediting agencies or bodies. Some would be a CACREP accreditation, which stands for the Council for Accreditation of Counseling and Related Educational Programs. There's M MPCAC, Masters in Psychology and Counseling Accreditation Council. So look at who is accrediting it, and if there's a program that's not accredited, which we'll talk about, you should beware and maybe not do that program because some states require you to come from a certain accredited body like CACREP or just having any accreditation. And doctoral programs are accredited by APA, so the American Psychological Association. You should also think about, is the program preparing you for licensure? So some programs don't. So they don't meet the state requirement to become a licensed counselor or a licensed psychologist, and that would not be good. So you should ask these sorts of questions when you're looking at programs. So I really recommend people do their research and don't go to a program unless you know that this is a good program that will set you up for licensure and is accredited. Other things to think about if you're thinking about graduate school is the cost of living. You're not going to be making much money while you're in school. It's going to be hard to be working part-time. So maybe choosing somewhere with a low cost of living. Also be thinking about financial aid. How many loans do you really want to take out? And this is where sort of the rubber meets the road for a lot of people because graduate school is expensive. And this comes from a study in 2013 about how psychologists and counselors are in debt from graduate school. And the median, so this is not the average, this is the midpoint of debt for someone who gets a PsyD, this is that first one, is $200,000 in debt. And that's why I generally don't recommend people go the PsyD route, is because that will take your lifetime to pay off, probably. It's very, very expensive, and psychologists don't make as much as like a doctor. And this is more like doctor, like a medical doctor. That would be more typical for med school debt. PhDs still have a lot of debt. Average, or I mean, the median is 75,000. And this isn't from the study, but I would estimate that a lot of masters, when people come out, they're $40,000 to $50,000 in debt. So it's a big financial decision to go to graduate school. And you should think about, okay, how much is this going to cost me? Is it worth it? Some programs have assistantships, particularly doctorate programs have assistantships where you work for the university and you get part of your tuition paid. So when I went to University of Tennessee, part of why I chose that school is that they had assistantship. So I would work 20 hours a week for the school. I taught classes, and then I took my own classes, and the school paid for the tuition. I still had to pay other things, but the assistantship helped pay for my tuition. So you should look into that, particularly for doctoral programs. I don't see this often for master's programs. So I pulled up some programs in Maryland just to cover some options. At the master's level, there's a bunch of different options that have masters in mental health counseling or school counseling. And like some of these, Towson, um, Hood, have accredited programs. So this one in mental health counseling, there's a 60 credit hour option and a 48 credit hour option. I would recommend 60 credit hour option because that is what you need to get licensed in Maryland. Why they have a 48 credit hour option, I don't know, because you can't get licensed unless you go to a 60 credit program. So these are sort of some of the details that you should look at. For example, this one, MA in clinical psych, doesn't have any accredited name next to it. Johns Hopkins, while a great school, I just learned that last year they lost their accreditation, and they're reapplying for it this summer. But these two programs, for the time being, didn't meet the standards. And the particular one that Johns Hopkins Why it lost its accreditation is because they had too many adjuncts teaching the courses, and this isn't good for the quality of the courses because we don't know who these people are, and so they ended up losing accreditation. They might get it back starting this summer, but just something to look into. So that was master's level. And then PhD level programs, there are a few different APA accredited programs in Maryland. Loyola University Maryland, UMBC, University of Maryland has 3 programs, one in counseling, one in clinical, and one in school. And then the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences has a clinical PhD. So these are various doctorate level programs in Maryland. Now, for doctorate programs, they're very competitive, and I often encourage people, if they're applying, to do nationwide searches because, for example, I applied to University of Wisconsin, Tennessee, University of Memphis, University of Maryland, and so on, and they're quite competitive. So the broader you go, the better. And for doctorate programs, you often want to look at who you want to do research with. So who would you want to be your advisor? And that is one way to help pick which program you go to. Other things just to think about for training and professional growth is that once you graduate, you still need to get licensed. So, for example, I am a graduate, I have a PhD in counseling psychology, but I don't have a license yet because you have to do extra things. So, once you're licensed or once you graduate and shown that you're taking your coursework, you have to have more internships. You have to have enough hours at practicums and internships to tell the state that you're um, competent. And then you need to take a bunch of exams. And so all the states have different license like acronyms, but these are just some ones that I looked up for Maryland. There's licensed clinical professional counselor, which is an LCPC. There's a licensed certified social worker, LCSWC, means that they're clinical. Licensed clinical marriage and family therapist, licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor, licensed clinical professional art therapist, doctoral level is a licensed psychologist. Just a side note that this one often doesn't require a master's and only requires associate's degree, the alcohol and drug counselor. I don't know why that one has a lower requirement. But just to know that there's a bunch of different ways that you have to get licensed once you graduate. So this takes extra time and money. And I'm just going to show you one of these as an example. So in order to become a master's level counselor, a licensed clinical professional counselor, you have to have a master's degree totaling over 60 semester hours, and they have to have specific areas. You have to pass an exam. You have to have over 3 years of experience, and this has to be, some of those have to be postmasters. So after you graduate, you do something else. You're not fully licensed. You have like a provisional license for a few years. Then you need 3,000 hours of supervised experiences. So these hours doing internships, jobs where you're getting supervised so that they know that you're competent. And then there's requirements for supervision and pass the Maryland law test. So this is why I'm not currently licensed, is because I've done like this first part with a doctorate degree, but there's all these other steps that people have to do to get licensed and become a therapist. So it's a really arduous task and takes a lot of time and money. And I just want to let people know, like when you're seeing a therapist or working with your therapist, they've had a lot of experience, had a lot of hours being put into this training and their job to make sure that we're only having qualified people do therapy. So that's just one example of the process to get licensed. A few other things just to think about with professional development is that what are the median salaries? And I got this information from ONET last year, but if For people with a master's in mental health counseling, a median salary is 46,000. A doctorate level salary is 75,000. So these are just things to think about as you're pursuing different career paths. Is you might want to look at what are common salaries, and you can use that ONET website that I talked about in the career counseling and work psychology, vocational psychology lessons to look up different careers. So the final few slides are going to be on what counseling psychologists actually do. So these are the doctoral level psychologists, counseling psychologists, and they do a variety of things. Some do practice. So out of my cohort of people who studied with me, most do practice. They work with people in hospitals, in colleges, and treat people with whatever issues that they're coming to therapy for. So individual, group, etc. Some do research. So like Dr. Kisler and Dr. Williams here at the school, um, they're in an academic setting and doing research. Some work for government programs, nonprofits, and then teaching. So like Dr. Williams, me, and Dr. Kisler, we're all counseling psychologists who do teaching and research. So looking at where counseling psychologists actually work, about half work at colleges, some work in human services, and as you go further down the line, there's some that do independent practice and hospitals. And you can see that if we were to compare this to clinical psychologists, many more work in hospitals and independent practice for clinical psychologists. So the final slide really to talk about is how to overcome challenges in your own professional development. So these are tips about ways of thinking that as you're going throughout college, as you're thinking about your own careers and life, um, tips that the book's authors gave to its readers who are thinking about these careers. So the first one is thinking about your attitude and perhaps changing a means to an end attitude into an attitude of professional development. And so, what does this mean? Oftentimes, people think about the various hoops that they have to jump through. Okay, I have to get through these classes to get this degree and then apply to those schools to get that degree. And it just is this is sort of a means to an end attitude versus really thinking about what are you learning along the way? How are you growing as a professional? How are you developing as a professional? And so they're really encouraging you to not just look for the next step, next hurdle to jump through, but really make the most of every experience and think about what am I learning along the way in professional development. The next tip was to change self preservation into self actualization. So, really just think about okay, where do you want to go? How can you be the best you that you want to be? And move towards it. Now, I will say that these tips were not done in time of pandemic. Sometimes self-preservation is all you need. But this is just a tip to think about of when you can switch between the two. Maybe there are times where you need to self-preserve and times where you need to push yourself to go a little bit further. The next tip is to learn to balance dependence and independence. So if you think about your school, graduate school, there are times where you need to rely on others, where you need to rely on your teachers, rely on other students for group projects. And then there are times where you need to show independence and your own skills on your own. And so being able to do both of these, that at times you need to depend on others because you're not going to know it all. And there are other times where you really need to push yourself to be more independent and take on new tasks. So this is really important as you grow and as you develop professionally. The next step that they challenge you to do is to find a mentor. So find someone who is doing something that you like and see if they can help mentor you along your career journey. Think about um, so when you're thinking about graduate school, as I mentioned, specifically for PhD programs, you need to find a mentor that is not only researching the things that interest you. So finding, let's say you're interested in trauma and you look up all the various psychologists who are studying trauma. It's not just that their interests have to match, but it should be a good fit so that when you meet them, you feel comfortable around them. They're a good teacher helping you learn new skills. You'd be surprised, but many psychology programs don't have the best teachers, don't have the best mentors. So thinking about not just the interest match, but a good fit. Actively coping with disappointments. So disappointments are going to be along the way of all of your journeys. Um, they've been there for my journey. It's just a part of professional development. But learn, how do you cope with these disappointments when they come? What are some things that you can do um, when they happen? Are there things that you can learn from them? Things that you can take um, and change for next time? So thinking about different ways to cope with disappointment. And then the final tip that the authors of the book give is finding personal development in professional development. So really thinking about, what are your values? What are your goals personally? And how do these align or not align with professional development goals? They don't have to align perfectly. Maybe for some of you, it's just a job is a way to get um, money for food on the table. That's perfectly fine. But thinking about, okay, um, thinking about when they intersect and when they don't, and then focusing some on your personal development as well. So these are just tips that the book gave. You can read a little bit about them more. But this wraps up our lecture on um, training and professional development in counseling psychology. I don't expect that all of you will want to be counseling psychologists. I don't expect that all of you want to even be counselors. But hopefully, this has given you a chance to pause and reflect on your own development, your careers as college students, and jobs and careers down the line. Please let me know if you have any questions on this or on to any other parts of the lecture. And then for the final slide, I just want you to return to the beginning. We're not going to do this in small groups, obviously, but think back to day one and think back to how you saw counseling at the start. And now would like you to reflect on how things have changed or how things have stayed the same. What have you learned? What parts of counseling didn't you know about before? And if you could add or change anything about that original definition, what would you do? So, really just reflecting on this course and the ways that you've learned and developed and grown um, as a student, as someone interested in counseling psych, and just take a moment to reflect and return back to the beginning. Thanks again, and we will see you in class this week.